Welcome to the Matt Waller Podcast, where we look at success at the intersection of technology, logistics, supply chain, retail, and CPG, also known as the retail value chain. I want to clarify that this podcast is distinct from my responsibilities as a professor in the Sam M. Walton College of Business. Nonetheless, it aligns with my aspiration to provide practical insights to professionals and business by showcasing companies and people that can enhance your ability to manage, lead, and strategize and market effectively in the retail value chain. Before we dive into today's exciting episode, I'd like to thank our sponsor, New Road Capital Partners. New Road invests in proven technologies, services, and products that serve unmet needs in the marketplace. They look for companies in supply chain and logistics, as well as consumer-oriented companies. For more information, go to newroadcp.com. I would also like to disclose that I am a strategic advisor to New Road. I'd also like to recognize podcastvideos.com for the services they provide for these podcasts. I'm very pleased with their services. And now, without further ado, let's get into the exciting episode. Today, I'm interviewing an incredible entrepreneur and leader, Gordon Downs, who's the founder and CEO of NYSHEX. And I think you're going to find this very interesting, V. He has 80% of the top 10 carriers, ocean container carriers, engaged in using NYSHEX, their platform. Many shippers are using it. The implications for it are incredible. It can help shippers reduce their expected lead time for ocean container shipping, reduce their variance of lead time. It can help shippers, reduce safety stock, reduce out of stocks. So it's very interesting in that regard. But it also helps carriers utilize their equipment more efficiently. But Gordon had many years of experience before he started NYSHEX. And in fact, he had about 12 years of experience with the largest ocean container carrier, Maersk. And then he had many years of experience with the largest beer shipper in the world, AB InBev. It was SABMiller back then. But he saw the problems from both ends of the supply chain, from being a carrier and from being a shipper. But he also had a good understanding of other partners in the supply chain, how these problems were occurring with them, such as third-party logistics firms, NVOCCs, et cetera. And so 8 years ago, he took to coming up with an information system to collect all of this data, to cleanse it, to harmonize it, and to make it available to everyone in the supply chain. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Gordon, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
So, Gordon, I was really excited to learn about NYSHEX, really interesting company. And of course, I'm familiar with your background. I already described it earlier. But you already had a pretty significant experience in the logistics industry. So if you wouldn't mind talking just a little bit about, what motivated you to found NYSHEX, but also how your experience led up to that.
Yeah, that's a long story, but I'll paraphrase it. I started my career at Maersk, and while I was at Maersk, I was fortunate enough to have lots of different roles. And I think most relevant was the time I spent in the trade function. And when you work as a trade manager or a line manager at a carrier, you're responsible for managing the vessels, the P&L, making sure that you've got the right cargo mix. And it's an interesting role. One of the biggest challenges that I experienced in that role was we would plan our vessels and our services based on contracts we had with our customers. And very often those contracts didn't materialize. The bookings would be made and would be canceled. And all of a sudden, you've got vessels that are sailing underutilized or services that aren't meeting the expectations you have. And that has a big impact on your profit and loss. It's also wasteful, just having vessels sailing around with empty space. So that was for me quite interesting, and also interesting in the sense that the way we dealt with these challenges was we would overbook the ships so that you can accommodate a little bit of what we would call downfall or shortfall. The problem is, of course, you never get it right. And there are many times we would overbook the ship and suddenly there's more cargo showing up for the vessel than what was expected. And all of a sudden you've got what we call roll or leave customers on the quayside. And of course, that again is very damaging for the customer. And so there are a lot of challenges that I had experienced working in the line function, but that's just the way the industry operates. I think most carriers operated in the same way as we used to operate at Maersk. And then I also spent 3 years at a company called SABMiller, which is now part of the AB InBev group. And there I was involved in digital transformation, but of course, very much played a role in the transportation side of things, the procurement and the supply chain. And it was fascinating to see how damaging those situations are when you're a customer. Again, when I worked at Maersk, I had a very clear sense of the issues from a carrier perspective, but it really struck me once I was at SABMiller, and you could see how damaging it is if, for instance, a container load of cans that are going to feed your canning line for a brewery in a specific location get delayed, and all of a sudden the consequences are very costly. And so this is clearly one of these situations that is both negative for the carrier and negative for the shipper. And that challenge really piqued my interest and caused me to go down a long journey of exploring how other industries have solved some of these problems. Because candidly, these problems have existed in other industries for years, but many of the other industries have solved these problems. So we looked at that, and ultimately that inspired me to start NYSHEX as a way to try and help this industry solve those type of problems.
So that's really interesting, having both sides, having worked on ocean shipping from, carrier perspective and the perspective and the shipper perspective, helped you see opportunities. And of course, one of the biggest, most important aspects of being an entrepreneur is understanding what is the problem. And so you saw it from two sides. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the problems you were saying?
Yeah. So the big problem really manifests itself in when the containers don't show up, and that, of course, creates waste in the system. But the challenges go deeper than that. The challenges are really, it's not when the container doesn't show up. It's all the things that should have happened before the container shows up that perhaps didn't happen. And compounding that is, it's actually often quite difficult to find out where the problem took place. So I'll give you an example. There are, of course, as you know, with the supply chain, there are many links in the supply chain, many parties involved in the process. And oftentimes you'll find, especially in the case of importing from another country, something will go wrong with that origin. Maybe the container didn't make it to the port on time. And it's actually quite difficult to know, was it because the container was late being loaded at the warehouse? Was the cargo not ready? Was the warehouse not functioning? Or was it the trucker that didn't get the container into the terminal on time? Was it some of the documentation that needed to be produced in order for that container to actually make its way into the terminal and onto the ship? And you're relying often on secondhand information, third parties who are telling you what happened. And again, it's not just one container where everyone's watching it. In many cases, these contracts include thousands of containers in many different origins and, of course, many different stakeholders involved in the process. And so it can become really complicated to see what went wrong. And again, that results in a lot of workload to try and dig into it, do the, as they say, the forensic investigation to find out what actually went wrong here, or you got to speak to multiple people. And then what often happens is people tend to attribute parts of the problem to others. And it does create a little bit of a blame game. And that creates a big strain on relationships, and especially in an industry like ours where relationships matter. If the trucker says, well, hey, I tried to gate it into the terminal, but someone at the carrier gave me the wrong information. I mean, that's just one silly example, but there are many others like it. And so you do end up oftentimes with people blaming one another. And then it's hard to really get to the source of the problem, to identify the root cause, and then actually make improvements if you don't really have all the facts. So this is a challenge that is A, taking a lot of work, B, it's putting a strain on relationships. But I would say most importantly, it's creating waste when a shipper can't get their container on the vessel. and suddenly they've got a problem where for example, their canning line is at risk because the cans are not available, or for the carrier waste, in the sense that you had planned for these containers to show up on your vessel, you held space for them, and all of a sudden they don't show up, and now your vessel is sailing underutilized. Of course, that's just wasteful. So, there's a great deal of complexity in these problems, and again, solving these problems at scale becomes very, very challenging.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me a little bit of the quality management era, where there was a movement to really identify sources of problems and eliminate them to redesign business processes. But you're looking at a global business process that really hasn't changed much for decades. So I would think changing something like that is even more difficult, obviously, and there's a lot of players involved, as you're saying. So how does the NYSHEX platform help address those problems?
So our approach to this has been trying to provide what we call a shared system of record, so that both the carrier and the shipper, as well as the 3PL or the NVO, whoever might be involved in the process, has one version of the facts, and it makes it easier to see where the problems are. Now, of course, creating that shared system of record is challenging because, once again, data is stored in different pockets throughout the supply chain. And again, data is one thing, but how you interpret the data, how you turn that into information and in analytics and insights, different companies can do that in different ways. And so that is also very challenging. So we spend a great deal of time really focused on capturing all the right data and being very transparent and thoughtful in how we analyze and display that information, so that both parties can look at it and recognize that it's a complete set of data. And of course, there's elements of us being neutral and us providing transparency without having any sort of incentive one way or the other to show one circumstance versus another circumstance. And so in order for us to accomplish that, we had to spend a great deal of time gathering data from the different sources. For instance, taking the schedule data from the carriers, the booking data, the equipment events, having shippers provide information perhaps about their purchase orders, about the requests that they've made for their bookings, and that's a growing list of data sets. And what's important to keep in mind here is that we're looking at data which is not just related to the movement of the cargo. The traditional sense of, where is my stuff, the basic visibility. Now, that's, of course, very important. But just as important as that is all the steps that need to be taken prior to the container actually moving. So that includes things like, was the vessel on time? Or was the vessel subject to delays or potentially a port omit? Was the booking requested on time? Was the booking requested within the allocation? Did the carrier have that allocation reserved for that customer or not? And so there's a great deal of step that we need to track beyond just the movement of the cargo. And so piecing all that information together, and then not just piecing it together, but translating it, harmonizing it so that everyone has a shared system of record that they recognize, is a big piece of the solution to this challenge. And then, of course, having information is one thing, but we all know about supply chain is that you cannot possibly manage every single purchase order or every single container. You really do have to manage by exception. So critical piece of this puzzle here is building not just the shared system of record, the data, the visibility, but also the workflows that allow a shipment or a booking or a vessel that's off track to create alerts so that the people who need to know something is off track get notified. And furthermore, a workflow such that the person who is informed, hey, this container is not yet gated into the terminal, or this booking should be made by now, but it's not being made by now. And then the workflow hopefully triggers action that allows the process to get back on track, or at the very least captures the reasons why this process went off track. And that's really important because the more reasons you have, the more you can start to see patterns. And again, it's shared, so the patterns are shared across all the parties in the supply chain. And that allows a troubleshooting process to begin, which is not based on, like we described before, that sort of blame game that can very easily happen in this industry. So there's a great deal of focus on, like I said, the shared system of record, the workflows that are layered on top of that shared system of record, and again, the analytics that are layered on top of that set of workflows and the underlying data.
So I could see how these notifications could be really valuable. Um, again, getting back to the quality management analogy here, in quality control, the goal is to try to not only identify what caused problems, but to sometimes identify problems before they manifest themselves in real problems. Does this have the ability to do that?
Oh, precisely. And that's a huge part of, I think, the value that can be created for everyone in the ecosystem who's using the system. Um, Once again, it's a complex supply chain, and there are many different stakeholders, and ultimately the stakeholders do create dependencies on one another. The challenge is information doesn't always flow as well as it should. I mean, people always joke, if you work in shipping and logistics, you're dealing with enormous amounts of emails, and it's hard to stay on top of everything, and there's a lot of noise in the data and so on. So we're trying to remove all of that. And one of the, I think, really exciting innovations is we have this application inside of our platform called the Exceptions Hub, which is a constant live stream of all the things that are going off track. Now, of course, that's great. But in addition to that, we also have alert management. So for example, a logistics director can go in and describe, what I should say, select different types of issues. Say, for example, origin issues where a container is at risk of not getting in at a specific location, and assign those exceptions to a specific user in their ecosystem. And then what will happen is the application will automatically email that specific user when we notice something is at risk of not getting in. And of course, you might say, well, people get too many emails as it is. Do we really want to have even more emails going? And of course, there's truth in that. But the hope is the email that the system can generate, we can curate that over time. In fact, we've already seen some great progress in this regard. So it becomes truly valuable. So when the logistics operator comes to work in the morning, one of the first things they get is a daily digest of all the things that they need to pay attention to. And so it's neatly laid out. It's very easy to see, what type of issue needs to be dealt with. And a couple of innovations we've added on top of that. The first one is, if there's any questions about what the issue is, they can click a link inside the email, and it immediately takes them to a screen where they can see exactly what has happened so far. They can see changes in the vessel, changes in the booking, changes in the equipment status, etc. So all of that information is available literally on one click. And furthermore, if they take action and they say, okay, this specific container is now being gated in, or I called the trucker and there's a problem, the trucker has a flat tire, inside the body of the email, they can click a link, and without having to even log into the application, they can classify this as a closed issue, and they can update the reason why it was closed. And so again, we're not asking a user to create more reports or more emails. We're actually trying to simplify this and create one summary where it's easy to keep track of all the issues or the exceptions that may be coming up during the course of the day. And so, coming back to the point, managing these exceptions really requires, number one, the information to be available in a very timely fashion, of course, which we're doing. But more importantly, it requires the person who needs that information to get it, to be able to declutter the information so that they know what to focus on, and also to create workflows so that it's clear what steps they need to take in order to solve the problem. And so we've seen a great deal of success in helping people identify these problems while there's still time to fix it and get the shipment back on track, if that's the case.
So the users of NYSHEX are the carriers and the shippers? Both?
Correct. We actually, in fact, have more than just carriers and shippers. We work very closely with NVOCCs, and of course, NVOCCs can act as a carrier and as a shipper, and in many cases, they'll do both for the same shipment. We also work with 3PLs, and the goal is to be able to add more stakeholders in the supply chain to the application. And of course, I think one of the big benefits here is by serving information to people that is truly valuable in a curated fashion where it's action-oriented, it's timely, we can do that via email. We don't even need people to log into the application. You can literally create value by reaching out to people in a structured way through the email. Yeah. So, the goal here is to really make this, to ensure that everyone who has a role to play in fulfilling these contracts, making sure that the cargo moves according to plan, is available, or at least able to see what's going on in this shared system of record, and we're creating value for them by reducing workload and creating transparency.
Yeah, making it so easy with just an email, I think has probably been pretty critical, I would guess, to your success. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And it sounds very simple, but it's actually very complicated because, again, you have to strike that balance of showing people information which is relevant to them, and you can't omit important information because if you do, you lose credibility. But by the same token, if you overload the email and you put too much information about these events in there, the noise tends to outweigh the benefit and you lose credibility and people don't pay attention. So striking that right balance is really important. Plus, of course, there's a lot of technical elements in this as well, because if you're asking people to update the status of a system in the email without having to log into the application, you have to do a lot of work with tokenization to make sure someone can click a button in the body of the email and we automatically update the system without necessarily authenticating that user through a login process. So there's a lot of complexity involved in making this work, but it's well worth the effort because when it does work, it really does unlock a great deal of value and makes it very easy for a shipper to be able to bring people from their supply chain onto the network.
So, which players did you get on first? The shippers, the carriers, the NVOCCs? How did you sequence that?
So this is really a chicken and egg sort of problem because, again, you can't solve this problem with only one side of the equation. You really do need everyone who's involved in the process to be involved. So the way we began was working with carrier shippers and NVOCCs, and we would host these workshops even before we had a product that was working. And together in these workshops, we would outline the key processes, the as-is and the to-be, and agree on things that needed to be provided, perhaps on a multi-carrier basis. We agreed on things where there was currently a challenge with regards to like data availability, a challenge with regards to could the data be trusted, etc. And so that's how we started. So we were really very deliberate about making sure that the way we addressed these problems, we did so in a fashion whereby we brought both the carrier, the shipper, and of course the NVO, who could act as both capacities, along the journey with us. In fact, we've done this at greater scale now that we're operating at a much larger extent than what we did when we began. By number one, we have board meetings, and at our board meetings, we have carriers and shippers represented on the board. We have this thing called a member council, which is a council that ultimately rolls up into the board that addresses our roadmap and helps us make decisions on what things to prioritize, how to tackle issues. And then we also have forums in a much larger format than what we did before, where we bring in the carriers, the shippers, and other stakeholders in the process and let them work with us and work with each other on how to address some of these issues. So again, unfortunately, there's not a simple answer. You can't tackle this problem by just addressing one side of the industry. You really have to bring the industry along the journey of solving these problems.
I would think, for a shipper, they would really be interested in this because, especially with interest rates being high, the cost of capital is high. And so you don't want to have to hold extra inventory. And the kind of things you were describing would be a way to reduce lead time, expected lead time, and the variance of the lead time. And so both of those, the longer the expected lead time, the more cycle stock you need. The higher the expected variance and lead time, the more safety stock you need. And the longer the lead time, too, the more in-transit inventory you have. So I could see a solution like this could actually free up a lot of capital for a shipper.
I agree. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to just improve not just the reliability, but in general, the efficiency of the process, the resilience of that supply chain as well.
And, having all of this data available and being able to identify what is the source of the problem, you could create histograms to see, where are these problems occurring the most, and then you could prioritize which ones you go after. And, these kinds of confusions that occur in a supply chain as a result of all these variances, result in a bunch of communication that follows that many times never gets anywhere because no one really has the same set of information. Do you actually see that play out in practice?
Oh, absolutely. I can't tell you how frequently we speak to either shippers or carriers or NVOs, and they would describe the process of their quarterly business reviews. And typically, the first portion of the quarterly business review is a discussion around whose data should be used to base the conversations upon. Because oftentimes, the shipper will show up to a quarterly business review with one set of the facts and set of reports and analytics, and the carrier will show up, and those might not necessarily match, especially when you get into some of the more complicated issues. So again, it's one thing to look at total containers moved. That's pretty easy to align on. But the hard part is for those containers that didn't move, which should have, why? And what are the patterns, to your point around histograms? And it's not just looking at what percentage of containers arrived on time or were gated in on time, etc. It's looking at basically that distribution curve, that histogram, and then starting to assign the causes for things that might have been outside of whatever the control parameters might have been. So again, all of this information is now starting to be produced in a way which is shared between the carrier and the shipper. All of the analytics are shared. So the shipper's version of the scorecard is exactly the same as the carrier's version. And so that really does allow the focus to be on how do we jointly, as partners, dig into these issues and come up with solutions versus an argument around, well, should I fix the problem or should you fix the problem? And that's something which is, I think, very constructive and widely appreciated. And coming back to your point, that really is the only way you can significantly improve the health of the supply chain and make it more resilient, reduce the unnecessary waste, build contingencies in when there are things that you should expect based on previous patterns, etc.
Solving this problem could have implications throughout the entire supply chain, because not just the ocean carriage piece of it, because I think, when a container arrives late or isn't on the ship when it was supposed to be, that creates all kinds of other problems in transportation, drayage, intermodal, warehouse labor management, driver management, and of course stockouts. I mean, stockouts are, you can actually, earlier I was talking about it from the perspective of freeing up capital, but maybe even bigger in some industries, especially when industries are at capacity, which so many are, at least in the United States. So if you have a container that's late, sometimes you're losing sales for good. It's not like it's delayed. It's a lost sale, not just a back order. And there's a lot more lost sales compared to back orders today than there used to be. I know a lot of the people probably involved in this part of the process may not be thinking about those things, but it actually could be the biggest savings in the whole process.
I completely agree with you. We've done some analysis on this, and if you can make just a tiny improvement on the amount of inventory, or in terms of the fulfillment rate, the OTIF, the value is enormous. I think the challenge is that some of these values are not necessarily understood across the supply chain or all of the stakeholders who need to take action. And so there's an element that we need to make it easier for people to appreciate the value that they can gain by improving on some of these processes, etc. But I think there's also something very interesting here, Matt, is that in order to realize that value, you need so many different people in the supply chain to act differently. So it's not as simple as the executive who looks at the analytics, makes some decisions, and provides instructions, and all of a sudden these problems get solved. It really is a combination of improving the planning process, not just making better plans, but how you communicate those plans, and not just the plan itself, but the why behind the plan, all of those components around the plan. And that is incredibly difficult. Once again, many different stakeholders involved in that process. And then the second part is, of course, once the plan is in action, it's all about the execution process. Are people following the plan? And of course, we all know that not every plan can be followed. ships get delayed, vessels blank, et cetera, when that happens, what are those contingencies and how are those things being tracked? So it really, the way we look at this is in order to get the big prize, which is, of course, making greater supply chain resilience, improving OTIF, reducing inventory levels, improving sort of fulfillment ratios. In order to get that, you really have to be excellent at planning and iterating on those plans. And you really have to be excellent at execution of those plans. And so that's a big part of how we think about this opportunity and helping people to benefit from using technology in both parts of those processes, the planning and execution process.
Well, I have to say, I'm really impressed. I know you started this company around 8 years ago, but I know your experience both from the shipper and carrier perspective to see the problem and also helped you kind of think about how to overcome the problem. But I would think that, you're 8 years into this, and I know you've made incredible progress. You have a functioning company, but it must have been really hard early on to try to get people to even listen to you, I would think. Was it?
Yeah, well, to be honest, most people who work in the industry experience the same pains that I experienced when I worked at Maersk and when I worked at SABMiller. And I think if you can present an opportunity that they might be able to reduce some of that pain, usually people will listen. And so, again, when we started, I think it was very helpful for me having come from the industry because I had, so to speak, walked in people in this industry's shoes before. And I was able to bring a somewhat fresh perspective, combining the shipper view, the carrier view, the technology view. And I think that is what gave people the incentive to pay attention. And of course, the key for us was, once we had people's attention, to solve problems that were very tangible. So we didn't start off with the big, really high level, hard to reach problems because it's hard to get to those. So we really had to begin with the tactical things. And even today, when we work with shippers who are not familiar with the technology, a large part of the sell is really, hey, these type of issues, for example, when you place bookings and the carrier doesn't confirm your bookings because maybe the carrier doesn't have the allocation in their system, we can help you solve this problem. Or this issue that you have around, you don't know which carrier you want to allocate your volumes to in your next round of tenders because you don't have all the data around the carrier's actual performance. Once again, it's very easy to look at the carrier's vessel schedules and see how reliable the vessels are. But actually, that's not what's important. What's important is when you try and book with that carrier, are you getting the space on that vessel? Is the carrier giving you the empty equipment? And then once your container's on that vessel, what is the actual risk of delay getting through the terminals, the risk of being stuck on the other side and potentially incurring detention and demurrage? So solving those really tactical problems. And then once you demonstrate value there, you almost get the license to be able to expand the value proposition and say, okay, well, now that we've solved this problem, let's look at some of these other problems we can help you solve. And to be honest, the really challenging part is if you want to solve even the most tactical problem, you can't just solve it for one person. That's the thing about supply chain. There are inherently multiple stakeholders involved, not just within a company. For example, within a company, you've got to deal with the person who's going to approve the financials, to pay for the service. You've got to work with the person who's doing the planning, the person who's deciding on which carriers to use. You've got to deal with the person who's placing the bookings, etc. You've got to get all of these people to agree not only to use the system, but to actually use it once the system is implemented. So there's a lot of, I would say, hard work required in order to get this sort of process moving. But I would say it gets easier once you have some proof points under the belt, and you can point to case studies. And there are many shippers out there that have experienced the value of this, and that makes it easier. We build credibility, and of course, when we build the system, the product, as we call it, starts to generate, I would say, credibility in its own right. So, it definitely is a process. It's not something that you can do sort of overnight with some whiz-bang technology and drop it into our industry, and all of a sudden things work better. I think it's a game of inches, and it really has to be a game of producing value each step as you move forward.
So the shipper benefits are very obvious to me. What are the carrier benefits?
So this is the beauty. I think that when you have an industry like ours, where there is essentially a waste in the system, for example, when a container doesn't make it on a ship that should have, it costs everyone, right? The carrier has a ship that's sailing in light, and the shipper now has a problem where the container is not on the vessel, and now the shipper either has to face a delay or potentially incur some contingency costs, the ship with a backup carrier, or even worse, air freight. So this type of waste produces opportunities for everyone. It truly is a win-win outcome here. So specifically on the carrier side, how do they benefit? Well, I think the carrier's benefits fall into the same three buckets that a shipper benefits fall into. So the first one is, of course, by helping a shipper perform better on their supply chain and be better at planning and better at execution, it means that the shipper is more likely to show up for the vessel within the cutoff time. And that allows a carrier to benefit from better utilization on the vessel. In fact, if the carrier has more conviction, or I should say a reliable forecast from the shipper, or can forecast with greater certainty what volume that shipper is going to produce, the carrier is able to better serve that shipper. They can make sure that those empty containers are reserved for that shipper, that allocation on the vessel is reserved for that shipper. And essentially, this is very important for carriers because they actually really want to provide great service to their customers. It's just hard when you're operating these massive networks and there's so much variation in the processes, and it's hard to anticipate what's going to show up. But those shippers who can be more reliable become what's called a shipper of choice, and it's much easier for a carrier to service those customers. And of course, the carriers benefit just as much as the shipper benefits. The other bucket of value is on workload. When you have a situation where things are not going according to track, then the carrier has to rework that booking, or they have to call up the shipper and find out what happened to this container. It was supposed to get in before the cutoff. All of that is work. And then they've got to replan the ship based on the containers that should have shown up but didn't show up. So there's all this workload that gets put into these processes when they go off track. So reducing that workload for the carrier is significant. And again, going really into the theoretical here, but it's important because I think people in the industry will recognize this. The relationships between carriers and shippers often get strained because of information just doesn't flow. And it's so easy for someone who works for a shipper based out in Ningbo, hypothetically, to blame something that goes off track on a carrier because it's just easy to do that. And whether or not that's the truth, it often ends up being the sort of the default answer, like carrier didn't have equipment or carrier rejected booking. And of course, when that happens, it starts to strain the relationships between carriers and shippers. But if you can create a world where both the carrier and the shipper are looking at the same set of facts, are able to identify the problems, I think what we have seen is carriers are very willing to accept that where they have areas to improve, they'll take action and look to improve that as long as it's fair. And I think it's true also for a shipper. If they can see that they've got a problem with their origin team isn't gating containers in on time, they can take action to solve that. And when both parties are working together to sort of streamline steps in the process, it creates enormous value. And not only enormous value, but it strengthens those relationships between the partners. And that's something which, again, people who work in this industry put a big premium on.
So what do you see as the biggest growth opportunities for NYSHEX in the future?
So again, our focus is exclusively on solving problems for carriers, shippers, and NVOCCs. Our mission really is to unite those parties with a shared system of record and all the technology that we can provide. And we've been very much focused on solving this problem of performance. That is our core focus right now. And truth is, we're just scratching the surface of that problem space. The last year, 2023, we processed 3.2 million TEUs, which is around about 2% of the total market. So, and again, in that period, we were able to show an improvement on contract fulfillment of about 20%. So that's a big improvement and a lot of opportunity. And of course, we have a lot of opportunity to expand beyond just 2% of the total market. So that's a huge part of our focus, is just executing on the strategy that we have today, getting more carriers, shippers, and NVOCCs to use this shared system of record to benefit from the workflows, to further enhance the workflows and the analytics. But beyond that, perhaps in the longer term, there's opportunities for us to look more carefully at things like, the invoicing process. There's a lot of, let's call it, unplanned expenses in the process for a shipper, and there's a lot of difficulty for carriers to project what their revenues might be. So there's an opportunity for us to work together with the carriers and the shippers to improve this invoicing process. One interesting fact here, just generally speaking across the industry, a quarter of invoices are disputed. And that's because it's so difficult to see what was actually agreed between the parties, what actually happened. These unplanned expenses, these contingencies, were they justified? And it's a huge challenge. But by, once again, using this concept of the shared system of record, all the data in one place, the carrier and the shipper and the NVOCC can all trust what's in there. They can all contribute to that data. It allows those things to be improved. And so there's a big opportunity in that respect. And there's also opportunities within the financial flows within this industry. Again, it's an enormous industry. It's about $200 billion worth of freight payments back and forth each year. And of course, many multiples of that in terms of cargo value that's being shipped around the planet. And so there's opportunities within the financial flows, and we're excited to explore those. But those are more longer term down the road.
I would think you would have some unique visibility to the overall lead time, like changes in expected lead time of ocean container shipping in general, standard deviation of that. It seems like I know you've only got 2% right now. That's still a lot. I mean, 2% is actually quite a lot. Are you able to see changes overall that are going on in the industry? Say, for example, the problems we're seeing in the Middle East, it's causing problems with container shipping through, the Red Sea. What do you see the impact of that in your data?
We do, but I think it's an interesting point that you brought up, because there's a really critical piece of our business model which I should just disclose here, and that is we don't own any of the data that gets processed on our systems. It really is owned by the carriers and the shippers and the NVOCCs. So we're not able to produce any reports or indexes on what's happening in the market. Again, we could do that, I suppose, if the carriers and the shippers and the NVOCCs agreed, you guys should go and produce these benchmarks to help them perform better. And that's something, of course, if our members want it, we can produce that. But we really are focused on helping individual carrier and shipper relationships, or carrier and NVO, or NVO and shipper relationships to perform better. And so, whilst we do have that information, this is not information that we're leveraging, we're not promoting, we're disclosing that beyond the parties who actually own that.
How did you come up with the name NYSHEX?
So that's a long story, but I'll summarize it. When we started the company, we looked at a lot of different industries that have had similar problems to the one that the container shipping industry has. And one of the most compelling cases was some of the industries like agriculture, some of the financial markets like bonds. And so we believed that some of those mechanisms, the exchange mechanisms, may be relevant to our industry. And so that's why we started off with the name Exchange. One quick carve out. I think a lot of people in our industry believe strongly, and I agree with this, that container shipping is not a commodity. Completely agree. It's very different to a commodity. But the concept of an exchange exists beyond just commodities. There are all types of different exchanges out there. So I just have to, of course, make that disclaimer. But that said, why then New York at the beginning of shipping exchange? And the answer to that is, of course, we knew that this solution that we're developing requires a lot of different things, but two very important things being, one, technology, and therefore you need great engineers, and two, support from the financial industry. And so therefore you need proximity to the big banks, the big financial institutions. So very quickly on the engineering side of things, there are engineers all around the world, and of course there's a lot of great engineers out on the West Coast, for example, Silicon Valley. But that's a set of engineering skills which is generally involved in some of these like social media, consumer, like Uber, for example, type of applications. When you look at engineers that are based in New York, generally speaking, they index more towards large-scale enterprise engineering skills. For example, there's a lot of engineers that work in the financial services industry. And those type of large-scale enterprise skills that exist in the engineering base in New York are really important for us, because our technology is used by carriers and shippers and NVOCCs around the world, they need to trust that the information they put in the system is secure. They need to trust that the system isn't going to be having uptime issues. And so those type of enterprise skills are critical for us. And so having a position in New York where we can hire great engineers that have experience working in big banks, etc., is a really critical piece of the puzzle. And of course, the last point, as I mentioned, was the financial industry. So again, we spent a lot of time studying these different industries, looking for patterns that could help us to try and solve some of the challenges we face in the shipping industry. A key part of the solution when we came up with it was looking at the way that, for example, Goldman Sachs played a role in the formation of so many wonderful companies that have played an enormous role in the financial industry. So you take, for example, the Intercontinental Exchange, which was essentially a consortium of big banks like Goldman Sachs and some of the other big banks, as well as some of the big oil players like Shell, BP, Total. And they were able to build together a mechanism that created enormous value for all the participants in the market, on the oil market. So our ability to raise a Series A from Goldman Sachs, they led our Series A, they're still very active in the company today, really helped us to tap into that deep pattern recognition that exists within those type of industries and apply those patterns back to our industry. So New York was very important. Shipping Exchange was very important. You put those two together, you get New York Shipping Exchange. And of course, that's a real mouthful. So we just abbreviated and said NYSHEX. That's the name we go by.
I like it. I mean, I think NYSHEX, when I first saw it, I thought, is this an exchange I'm not familiar with? I was trying to think through it, but it seems to give some credibility. I like it. Good name.
Just picking up that thread on credibility, the category of shipping exchanges is rather nascent. There are about 5 significant shipping exchanges around the world today. So it isn't that well known. But recently, in June of 2022, there was a new act passed in Washington, D.C. called the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, or OSRA 22 for short. And what's interesting there is in that act, there was a provision that established shipping exchanges for the first time and provided a definition for shipping exchanges, and then set out that the Federal Maritime Commission should regulate shipping exchanges in a similar way in which, for example, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission regulates commodity exchanges and the SEC regulates securities exchanges. Now, shipping exchanges have A, formal definition in the legislation, and B, a formal regulator, which is, of course, I think very, very prominent and establishes a great deal more credibility in the function that shipping exchanges need to play in this industry.
So, Gordon, if I'm a shipper and I'm using this technology, what does it do?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. And the way to address that question is just to put on the table first, what are the 3 questions that we help a shipper to answer? The first question is, what was expected? The second question is, what went wrong? The third question is, what to do now? And the fourth question is, how well it all went. And so we've built our technology around specifically helping shippers to answer those 4 questions. So on the first question is, what was expected? So here, the technology, the product has some really powerful features. The first of which is what we call dynamic plan. So the shipper can log into the system. They can see the historic data, what was shipped with each carrier. They can see what lanes all that volume was shipped on. And inside the system, they can produce a forward-looking plan. Very easily, they can do it in the application, or they can use Excel to upload and download their plan. And we overlay that with what are the allocations that they may have been granted by their carriers, what are the contractual commitments that they may have, etc. So that what we call dynamic plan is a very effective way for a shipper to have a forward view as to what they plan to ship, not only with each carrier, but with each origin on each week, and to communicate that internally so that their people on the ground in the various origins around the world can see it. And in some respects, we're able to relay some of that information to the carrier so that the carrier can see what to expect from each shipper. Of course, protecting the data privacy that each of our members have when using the application. And so producing this dynamic plan really helps the carrier to communicate to all their partners what is expected, answering that first question. The second component is what we call real-time alerts. And so we talked about this briefly, but whenever something goes off plan, whether that's a booking that should have been made on a specific carrier but was not, or a container that should have been gated into a port but was running late, or a vessel that should have arrived but is now running late, anything that goes off plan creates an alert. And like we talked about briefly before, these alerts can be configured so that a specific type of alert in a specific geography gets sent to the person who is responsible for addressing those type of issues. So it really is a hub where you can manage all these type of exceptions, and you can triage systematically who they need to go to. And again, producing those alerts in near real time allows people to take action and hopefully get those things back on track. And so that really goes back to answering that question, what went wrong, and being able to answer that question is in as close to real time as possible. The third question, I should say, is what to do now. And so that's really where these further workflows come in. The broader tool, what we call our exceptions hub, when as a shipper, you can log in, you can see all the things that are going off track. You can actually configure that to provide specific steps that need to be taken in specific types of issues. And again, when these things are going off track and being resolved according to whatever that workflow might be, we're capturing all that data in a structured fashion. So it's not stuck in email or in Excel spreadsheets or whatever it might be. So that's the third question, what to do now. And then the final question is how well it went. And that really completes the loop, because if you can answer how well it went, you can actually improve the planning process, and overall you create this sort of virtuous cycle. So how do we address the question of how well it went? Well, that's where we provide a very comprehensive set of what we call insights or ocean analytics. So all of the data in the application gets served back to the member in a set of scorecards. All the data can be downloaded in Excel. It can be plugged directly into a system like a Power BI or a ClickView. And that's where you can see things like the broader patterns, those histograms we talked about. You can see not just the average transit time, but you can see on average, how many of those shipments are delayed by 1 day, or how many are delayed by 3 or 5 days, etc. So there's a great deal of granularity. And once again, all of those insights can facilitate not just your planning process, but can also facilitate the conversations that you might be having with your carrier partner or your 3PL or your own internal team that might be based out of the origin, making sure that they're focused on the right issues and improving all those key metrics and insights. So those are the four parts of the system that answer those 4 questions.
Some of the things you mentioned that it captures, like creating a distribution of delays. There are shippers out there that have inventory systems that would allow them to input data like that, but they've never had that data. So actually using that kind of information could make their inventory planning and inventory management more accurate. I was wondering when the day would come when we would actually be able to start doing that, because it's not been available for as long as I've been paying attention to it.
No, you did right, Matt. And that's a huge problem, because again, like all this data is siloed in all these different systems. And now, once again, by creating this sort of trusted shared system of record, where parties can essentially pool their data together and create that complete view of everything that happened and extract all these insights and statistical patterns, etc. Very powerful. And once again, all of this information is structured, it's cleansed, it's harmonized, and therefore it can be plugged directly into an analytics tool or even in some cases into a working application. Some of our partners use our technology or the platform as a microservice within their system environment. So all of these things are now becoming possible. But again, it is an early technology, and it's exciting to see, hopefully, how this can be used in new ways once people start to plug it into their applications, plug it into the existing systems.
If a shipper adopts this and is new to this, and they say, would you help me think through how to best utilize this? Do you have a process for doing that?
Yes, we do. We have some case studies which explain to the shipper how other companies like theirs have used this in the past and what are some of the benefits that they got. And then hopefully that makes it easier for that shipper to understand what benefits they could get from using the system. And for the larger shippers, we have an enterprise program. And with those enterprise programs, we'll work more closely with the shipper to help them understand what data is available, to understand from them what data they might have, how they might want to push and pull data back and forth between the system. So for enterprise shippers, there's a large opportunity there. So yeah, we're excited about this. And the more we work with shippers and understand how they're using the system, the more it informs our own roadmap so that we can continue to develop features that are going to be relevant for shippers.
That is so exciting. Also, I'm wondering, I mean, you had 12 years of experience with the largest ocean container shipper in the world, Maersk. How many carriers do you have on board so far?
So we have 8 of the world's top 10 global carriers on the application so far.
That's a pretty good percentage.
Yeah, we're pleased about that.
Wow. That was great. You did a great job, Gordon.
Thank you. Well, you did a great job of leading me through it. I felt like I was in safe hands throughout the entire process.
Good. Okay, well, you have a wonderful day.
You too. And thanks again, Matt, for doing this. And I really look forward to our secondary conversation around inventory calculation.
Yeah.
I'm excited to learn from you on that.
That'll be awesome. Okay, we'll see you later. Bye-bye. If you're finding value in this podcast, we greatly appreciate your support by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Additionally, following us on Apple and Spotify and leaving up to a 5-star review would be immensely helpful. We welcome any feedback or questions related to the podcast, as well as suggestions for further topics and guests. You can leave your comments on our YouTube channel, and rest assured that I will read each and every one of them. Please also take a moment to check out our podcast sponsors, as they play a critical role in keeping this podcast running. For more information on specific topics, timestamps, or links to articles mentioned during the podcast, head over to mattwallerpodcast.com.